Would you pray with me? Lord, may your word be our rule, your Spirit our teacher, and the glory of Jesus our single concern. And all that people said. Amen. Friends, we continue our walk through the book of Exodus, the book that we love, the book that tells our story, the story of God's people. Last week, we said that it might have been a really good place for the Bible to end because everything was wrapped up really neatly with a perfect little bow. Moses had come down the mountain and had laid all of God's instructions before the people, and everybody said, yes, everything that you have said we will do. And they celebrated a festival meal together, and everything just seemed so right. If the Bible had ended last week, I think that God's people would be really easy to pick out of a crowd. Because if the Bible had ended last week, all God's people would be those perfect, shiny people whose lives just look absolutely perfect. If the Bible had stopped last week, they would be those people whose lawn is always perfectly manicured. Their truck is always clean. Their family is always smiling. They don't have a care. Should we laugh there a little longer? Everything would be totally perfect. But the Bible didn't stop last week. There's more than one step to being the people of God. There's a step 2. Now, the first step that we were in last week is critical, and it's so important. It's the beginning of the relationship. It's that honeymoon stage. It's that realization that in the space of this new relationship, there is life and joy and a future and a freedom that you didn't know before. It's essential at the beginning of the relationship to have that hope and that space of beauty and freedom and just pure joy. It's in that moment when we bring this into our relationship with God, it's at that moment, that first step, when you first say yes to God, that God seems so close. The presence of God is so real. It's so tangible. And the hope of the future stands in such contrast. But then something happens. Time happens. Life happens. Difficulty happens. Step 2 happens. And you wake up one morning and you might realize all of a sudden that God doesn't seem as close as he used to seem. If you have ever found yourself at step 2, then listen to the word of the Lord today. Because Exodus is our story. It is our story from God's perspective, which means that it is true. The story of step 2 of God's people comes to us today from Exodus chapter 32. You can find it on an insert in your bulletin if that helps you to follow along. Let's listen to the word of the Lord. The people saw that Moses was taking a long time to come down from the mountain. So they gathered around Aaron and said to him, "Come on, make us gods who can lead us. As for this man Moses, who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we don't have a clue what's happened to him." Aaron said to them, "All right, take out the gold rings from the ears of your sons, your wives, and your daughters, and bring them to me." So all the people took the gold rings from their ears and brought them to Aaron. He collected them and tied them up in a cloth, and then he made a metal image of a bull calf. And the people declared, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." Now when Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of the calf. And then Aaron announced, "Tomorrow will be a festival to the Lord." They got up early the next day, and they offered entirely burned offerings and they brought well-being sacrifices. The people sat down to eat, and then they got up to celebrate. The Lord spoke to Moses. "Hurry up, go down. Your people, whom you brought up out of Egypt, are ruining everything. They have already abandoned the path that I commanded. They have made a metal bull calf for themselves. They bowed down to it and offered sacrifices to it and declared, 'These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt.'" The Lord said to Moses, "I have been watching these people. I have seen how stubborn they are. Now, leave me alone. Let my fury burn and devour them. Then I'll make a great nation out of you." But Moses pleaded with the Lord, his God, saying, "Lord, why does your fury burn against your own people, whom you led out of Egypt with great power and with amazing force? Why should the people of Egypt say, 'He had an evil plan to take the people out and kill them in the mountains, and so wipe them off the face of the earth'? Calm down your fierce anger. Change your mind about the terrible things to your own people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, your servants, to whom you promised, 'I'll make your descendants as many as the stars in the sky. And I promise to give your descendants the whole land to possess for all time.' Then the Lord changed his mind about the terrible things he said he would do to his people. Friends, this is the word of the Lord. If you are grateful, say, "Thanks be to God."
Thanks be to God.
Last week, We saw this encounter with God and God's people. We saw the moment that God's people became God's people. It was this heady, bubbly time, butterflies in your stomach kind of a time. The beginning of a wonderful relationship. Moses, God's leader, at the end of that time, he went up on the mountain for 40 days. Between last week and this week, Moses has been 40 days on the mountain, saturated in God's presence. I think that perhaps no human has ever known quite that sort of space that Moses would have been in for 40 days. I mean, think of all that Moses had been through. Given up by his own family. Raised as an ethnic minority in a house that wasn't really his own. Forced to leave his land, then come back to it, endure all kinds of crazy things. The level of stress in Moses' life was through the roof. He finally gets back to the mountain. He gets back to the mountain. Remember, the same mountain that at the burning bush God says, "This is how you will know," God said to Moses, "that I am with you. You will worship with the people at this mountain." We might have missed it because at the burning bush God calls it Mount Horeb, and here we call it Mount Sinai, but it's the same mountain. Moses is at the mountain and he sees and he's worshiping with the people. He's got this confirmation from God that he knows that God is with him. And all the people, everybody, this whole massive nation says, yes, we are in. And then from that place, the place that no leader could possibly think of a better place to be, he goes on the mountain and sits and marinates in God's presence for 40 days. That has got to be just about the best possible place that a human could be. And then step 2. Sometime during those 40 days, the mood on the ground at the foot of the mountain changed. Sometime in those 40 days when Moses was out of cell contact, the people started to get anxious. The time came where they had just waited too long. Sure, they had heard that God had made them his people, and they were waiting for something to happen. But they were just waiting. It might be worth saying that when the Hebrews said 40 days and 40 nights, the point of that, it wasn't really to say 40 days and not 39 and not 41. It's kind of like the way we would say he was up there for 1 billion years. So there's a big number, a really long time. So it might have been more than 3 weeks or 4 weeks and a few days. It might have been, we don't really know how long. It was a long time. It was long enough for God's people to forget, to lose their nerve, to let their anxiety get out of control. And this is the story of what happens when we forget God and let our anxiety run away from us. The people came to Aaron and said, "We don't know where this Moses is that led us out of Egypt. Never mind that every other time in the book of Exodus, over and over and over and over again, it's abundantly clear that God is the one who has led the people out of Egypt. Here the people say, Moses, that man that led us out of Egypt, we don't know where he is, and without him we're lost. So make us gods. Aaron himself falls for a catastrophic failure of leadership and gives in immediately. And what he says is so painfully tragic. He says, okay, give me the earrings out of your sons and daughters and your wives. You know where those earrings came from? Yeah. Those earrings were not sort of part of the people's natural wealth. When the Israelites were leaving Egypt, God stirred the hearts of the Egyptians to be kind to the people of Israel as they were leaving. It wasn't a big top-down sort of thing. It was very much just like a neighborly sort of thing. And God moved all of the Egyptians together to just give earrings and nose rings to their neighbors, the Hebrews, as they were on their way out. And in so doing, the people of Israel plundered Egypt. The gold of Egypt left on the ears of the Israelites. It was a sign of God's favor to the people, the inheritance that God was going to just give good things to his children, to his people. It wasn't going to be a matter of fighting their way through it. God was just going to give it to them. It's this inheritance that Aaron says, give it up. And everyone says, okay. They gave up the God that had drawn near to them, but was mysterious and not touchable, for something immediate and secure and physical they could touch. Did you notice what Aaron said? After the people look at the calf and say, this is who brought us out. Aaron says, tomorrow we will have a festival to the golden calf. No, he didn't. He said, tomorrow we will have a festival to the Lord. This is step 2. This is what happens when we encounter God. The God who made us in his own image. After that experience of encounter, so often our deep impulse is then to make God in our own image. We hold on to enough that we still want to call God the same God, but we're not loving God as he is. We're loving God as we want God to be. We exchange God's mystery, God's words, and God's symbols for a golden calf with no laws or mystery that points to nothing beyond itself. The word for this is adultery. The people of God who pledged their love to a God who had pledged his love to them, they're not giving up love. They're directing their love in a different direction. The first thing that Exodus 32 tells us is about us. It's about what we do almost automatically, almost without thinking about it. We want to make God in our own image, and in so doing, whether we use the right words or not. Perhaps especially when we continue to call God God. When we pattern our lives and worship that which is not God, it is no different from going to bed with someone that has the same name as your spouse, but is not your spouse. Then this passage shows us how God responds to that. Shows us how God responds to adultery. Our own spiritual adultery. And here it is in the point. Even in this most drastic rejection of God, God does not let go of us. In this way, it's a foretaste of Jesus Christ, who died for us while we were yet sinners. To bring these two images, it's as if Jesus Christ is at the church saying, "I do," and we were in bed with somebody else. This is the love that God has for us. This is the love that God shows us so clearly in Jesus Christ. And there's one final thing that this passage says about the people of God. You see, Moses here is Israel's prophet and Israel's priest. That means that as prophet, he's the one that speaks God's words to God's people. That's what a prophet does. He speaks God's words. And the priest is the one who stands between God and everybody else. That's why Moses was the one on the mountain. That's why Moses got the words, and then Moses brought them down to the people, because Moses was the priest that God had appointed. Jesus Christ is the true, the real, the great high priest. The high priest that stands between God and everyone else. And it is through Christ that all who believe in his name, all Christians, participate in Christ's priestly work. That's why the New Testament refers to us as a holy nation. That's why the Protestant church, and now the Catholic Church too, refers to the priesthood of all believers. Because it is understood that Christians stand in this role of somewhere between God and the creation that does not recognize God as God. Why does that make such a big difference here? Because of what Moses' job here is as priest. This is a difficult passage to read. In this passage, we see at the end, the passage ends right where we just were, which says that even in this most drastic adultery, that God will not leave us. This is where it ends, and that is the bottom line. So what do we do with this middle part, where God seems to turn his back on the people? What do we do with the God that responds with such anger that he's ready to destroy this people that he's brought out of Egypt? What do we do with that? Here's what I think we do with that. I think that in this chapter, we see the importance of the priestly role. The role of the priest here is to remember, as if God has forgotten, who God is and who God has promised to be and continue to do. I think that in order to grasp this story, we need to suspend for just a moment the fact that God doesn't actually forget. I believe that God does not actually forget. But I believe that to make a point in this story, in this chapter, that we need to suspend with Exodus for just a moment, that God doesn't actually forget. And to say, even if God forgets, will the priests remember? I think this comes down very squarely on us today as Christians. Will we remember who God is, who God has promised to be, what God has promised to do, even in the fictional event of God forgetting? Are we that familiar with God's promises? Do we feel the hope that deeply that we could, like Moses, say, God, this isn't like you. This is who you are. We have a deep responsibility to pray. As Moses prayed on behalf of the people to God, so we, you, priests, have a responsibility to pray for the creation that does not know God. We have a responsibility. And I think that the implication here is that the prayers of the faithful are a matter of life and death for those who do not know God. Christians have a particular role to play in this moment in America. Last week, we stood here, we remembered together that what was at stake in this election was not the reality of the church. That what was at stake in the election is not the continuation of God's people. And this is absolutely the case. We said that America, the project of America, is not the same thing as God's making a people. And yet we said we are also Americans, and we love this country, and we care for it. And it is our task as citizens of this country as well to care for and deeply nourish the society that the Lord has given us to live in. And the truth is that as America as a whole got a lot of divisions. Very split. And we don't feel that in quite the same way here in Clymer. We just don't. I mean, Clymer is not a swing district, right? Clymer, there's fascinating. Clymer, there were in this building, there were 444 votes cast for Trump Pence and 92 for Clinton. It's not even close, right? So we don't feel this sort of tension here the way that a lot of our fellow Americans are feeling. But that doesn't mean that the tension isn't there. And that doesn't excuse our responsibility, both as Christians and Americans, to take seriously our cultural moment. This is one way that I believe that we Christians have a deep responsibility to pray for our country, for peace, and to be part of that peace. The American church, the evangelical church, voted 81% for Donald Trump. That's roughly, I'm just thinking of this right now, that's basically the same percentage that we voted here in Clymer. About 80-20. What that means is that the nation as a whole sees the church as connected to Trump and the Trump administration. And here's what this means. This means that if the church is silent in response to the hate that is being done in Trump's name, if we are silent, people will lump us in with them. It is deeply important. It is a matter of faithfulness that Christians, frankly, whether or not you voted for Trump, it is an incredibly important matter for Christians, for evangelical Christians, to absolutely reject little black kids being told to go to the back of the bus. It is up to us to absolutely reject Muslims from being harassed and their cars beat on and tell them to leave the country. It is on us to reject the violence against our Hispanic brothers and sisters. If we are silent, it will be thought of as endorsement. Now, I say this because I know that we do not endorse these things. But unless we speak out, that is what will be communicated. Now, other people have other responsibilities. I call on the President and Hillary Clinton to condemn the riots in Portland and elsewhere. That is their job. We have a job too. We have a job to stand up and to say these things that are being done. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, we can talk later. There are lots of examples of these sorts of things. At my own college, Hope College, these events were taking place. Friends of friends have had hateful words in the name of Donald Trump spoken against them. It is our responsibility as Christians to say no to those acts of hate. It is our responsibility to say no. And if we don't, that is how America will see us as a church. And that is not okay. The center of our church is Jesus Christ. And for the Jesus Christ, the one who stands with the least, we can do no different. It's our responsibility to live in the context that God has given us. It's our responsibility to love. It's our responsibility to put our hope in Jesus Christ and live faithfully in response to that. So I invite you to say, let's rise and say together the words of the Nicene Creed on the backside of the scripture. We rise and let us confess together the words of our faith.